A world where only the strong survive. A world of Cadillacs and dinosaurs.
Howdy, I'm Jack and I make things sometimes. Like this modern deck for Magic the Gathering. I want to dig right into what is, in my opinion, the most important part of any brew, and that is the flavor. Maybe you haven't seen the show Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, as it's super niche and weird. I don't think that's going to detract away from the value of the deck, but I'd like to touch on some of the basics anyway. I don't have time in this deck tech to go over every bonkers aspect of the show, or the outstandingly cool comic it was based on, but you should definitely check them out if you get a chance. There are even some free versions on YouTube. The basic plot is that humanity destroyed the environment and spent centuries underground in bunkers until emerging in the far future to find that nature had taken back the planet and also brought back one of life's greatest hits, dinosaurs. And also psychic lizard people, for some reason. The bulk of the show follows Jack Tenrick, one of the few people who still know how to work with mechanical devices, and Hannah Dundee, a scientist from one of the neighboring tribes. It gets pretty political, as the premise about environmental collapse might indicate, but it's also downright absurd. Anyway, one thing the show really drove home was the concept of the Machinato Vitae, or the machinery of life. It's part karma, part biology, part vague hippie lizard person stuff. It's not really entirely clear what it entails, probably because the comic just gave up halfway through a story arc. But they talk about it all the time.
The Machinatio Vitae.
The Machinatio Vitae.
The Machinatio Vitae.
The machinery of life. I've heard of that.
The Machinatio Vitae.
The Machinatio Vitae.
Machinatio Vitae. They messed with the machinery of life, Hammer. And I guess they got caught in the gears.
And you should too while you're tapping dinosaurs to drive trains into your opponent's face. Now, you may be asking yourself, how can anyone turn a 90s cartoon into a deck of Magic the Gathering cards? By focusing on creatures, of course. Along with drawing cards and getting your best spells countered, creatures are one of the foundational aspects of Magic's gameplay. You know them, I know them, everybody knows them, but which creatures to choose? And how do we decide which creatures to build in defenses against? Here's where some of the theory of the deck comes into focus. There's a huge variety under the umbrella term creature. There's wizards, dragons, changelings, big boys, little boys, non-boys, pingers, swingers, and even the occasional flinger. With the incredible diversity of creature types, stats, and abilities that have been printed over Magic's history, it can be difficult, if not impossible, to build in defenses against all of them. Most of the time, a deck gets tied to whatever meta environment it was built for. This allows the deck to shine against its intended enemy, but only its intended enemy. Let's run through some potential instances of this issue. Suppose you put a few shocks in your deck in case you come up against a Bird of Paradise or a Llanowar Elves. You're in great shape to kneecap that mana dork, but what if your opponent drops a Ghalta Primal Hunger? You're gonna need some bigger burn. Suppose you pack a Victim of Night for that broad, damageless removal. Now Ghalta's not looking so hot, but if your opponent slaps down a Vampire Nighthawk, that removal is just a wasted card in hand sitting there staring back at you. Disappointed. And that's not even to mention Boggles with their cursed hex-proof bricking any and all targeted removal spells. So what can an aspiring brewer do about this problem? How can a deck make having creatures at all a liability for your opponent, while still being able to develop threats of its own? Is it possible to brew an effective deck when you focus on a flavor-first mentality? Well, I was pondering these exact questions one day while trying to come up with a fun deck to pilot in post-Rivals of Ixalan Standard, when I was hit with an idea for a nearly meta-proof strategy, one that, at the time of its inception, asterisk, was entirely standard legal. You see, I found myself staring at a particular card that I'd pulled, thinking about the exceedingly pushed abilities it provided, when I realized that in the right deck it could be broken. That card was Rampaging Ferocidon. It's a 3 CMC 3/3 with a host of extras. Menace for one, making the card easy to slot into any aggressive red strat, in addition to a literal off switch for life gain. And most importantly, it also has this third ability. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, Rampaging Ferocidon deals 1 damage to that creature's controller. It's like a fully roided reversed Soul Warden, and that makes it absolutely perfect for punishing the mere act of playing creatures. It doesn't matter the type or if it has hexproof or anything. If your opponent plays a creature, they take a damage. However, as the perspicacious among you may notice, this text is broad, meaning that playing one of these bad boys makes it so that you will also take some pings for playing creatures, which I assume was to balance out some of the many upsides with the card. Lucky for us, there is a way around this. You see, right before we visited the gold-laden plane of Ixalan, a few sets in the plane of Kaladesh were released, and this plane was full of broken combos and overpriced expeditions, but one of the big tools from those sets were vehicles. Vehicles vehicles are artifacts that can be temporarily turned into a creature by way of their Crew X ability, essentially letting you tap a number of different creatures to use the vehicle for normal attacking and blocking. Crucially though, vehicles are only considered creatures while crewed, and that means dropping any number of vehicles onto the field won't cause a single damage to yourself, even with an army of Ferocidons in play. This mitigates the downside to the point of making it negligible. For you. For any opponent that dares deign to play a creature, they're going to get a headache each and every time they do. Now that's the main thrust of the strategy, and with that out of the way, let's get into the full patented deck tech teardown. So the initial build of this deck was tricolor, using Kinjali's Caller and Siegehorn Ceratops to build up a board state, but I found that tends to dilute away from the creature punish strategy, and makes it much easier to get color locked. This iteration of the brew is limited to green-red, and is markedly more consistent for it, so much so that I play it with just basics. If you're looking for hyper-competitive viability, this is an easy area for improvement. Just swap in some of the fetch lands you've got laying around, I mean, who doesn't? And bam, you're top tier ready. Here's where the bulk of the deck sits, with a good number of one-cost spells to clear the opponent's field and occasionally dig for that clutch dino. One thing of note is that using Reckless Rage as our burn spell of choice can often blow up things that are designed to dodge a bolt for the exact same cost. It may also seem bad that this deals damage to one of our creatures, though with the few utility dinos we have included, this is usually an upside. Often when you lay a ranging raptor, your opponent will go out of their way to avoid dealing any damage to it, but with 1 mana you can pop something on their side of the field that's toughness 4 or less, and also ramp a land, and then usually swing in with the raptor anyway for bonus damage or another land if they block. There are also a few copies of Drover of the Mighty in there to get early mana for casting your buff spells, and keeping a disposable 3/3 later on for chumping or crewing in a pinch. Towards the late game, Shake the Foundations is one of the precious few pieces of refill in the deck, and it can also act as a weenie sweeper. Ooh, that's some terms. Can also act as a weenie sweeper, and a trigger for our angry dinos. There are also a few copies of both Tilanali's Crowned and Siege modification, which can make any dino a powerhouse, or can even help us go wide by making vehicles permanently into creatures. Immediately above our 3-drops, we have Forerunner of the Empire, and this is great in this deck for several reasons. First, he lets us tutor a dino, which could be a Ferocidon if we need to get one out there or replace one that got removed, or put a late-game bomb like Gulta or a Polyraptor on deck. And often the damage he deals to creatures on all sides of the field will help trigger some extra land, or make a million Polyraptors. We'll get into that later. Also at 4 is one of the better vehicle options we have, the true Cadillac of the deck.
That thing is a Cadillac.
Untethered Express. This card alone can be an absolute monster if your opponent can't find an answer. Doubly so if you can Siege modification for immense trample damage. If you want to ramp up the competitive viability, this is another area of easy improvement. Simply swap the Peace Walker Colossus and another copy of Aradara Express out for a full playset of these. As unlikely as a late game is with this deck, dropping 1 Polyraptor often means that they will exponentially replicate into dozens of copies. This is hilarious, but take care not to play one with a Ferocidon still on the field, lest you inadvertently deal 100 damage directly to your own face. Also on the top end, the Itali Primal Storms are definitely not an optimal inclusion for low-to-the-ground speed, but the ceiling in value you can get out of a Crowned Itali swinging for 9 and casting a card for free off the top of a deck is more than I can pass up. If you're looking for streamlining, swap the Italis in for more Gultas, as Gultas are bigger, meaner, and usually get cast for 2 mana. This deck absolutely shreds through token and flicker builds, but as I said, it's designed to be a favorable matchup against any build that features creatures. Features creatures. Evasive decks that avoid combat damage with flying or intimidate still pay the tax, and often have to throw their best pieces under the bus, or train, just to keep their life total up. Another good matchup for it is Life Gain. It's essentially a hard counter so long as you can keep a Ferocidon on the field, and often you'll be dishing out enough damage to keep them on the back foot from the early game on. Most often you'll be able to outpace other aggro decks, and depending on the composition of your opponent's deck, you'll have a good chance of dealing enough damage to keep mid-range builds from getting into late game, giving you a solid shot against most of the field in most metas. Now, while I did say it's meta-proof, it's not perfect. Control decks can often shut the deck down before it gets started, and something like Nexus of Gate doesn't even run creatures, pretty much nullifying our main strat. If you're lucky, or good at forecasting a Wrath of God, it can be beneficial in these matchups not to siege your vehicles, in order to play around the sweepers. It's also important to note that crewing a vehicle can be done by a creature still affected by summoning sickness, as it's not an ability on the creature itself. One other build that can wreck our whole strategy is anything to do with hand hate, mostly owing to the lack of refill. Ideally, you just shouldn't play with anyone who runs Thought Erasure. this is general rule. That's not just limited to this deck. On that note, another glaring weakness of this deck is that it's built for indiscriminate brutality. While that's great in 1v1 matches, that's not going to make you very popular in a 4-for-all style game. And in fact, it usually makes you the first target when a Ferocidon hits the field, and being taken down early usually means twiddling your thumbs while everyone else has fun. For that reason, I automatically DQ this from my pool of possible decks when shuffling up for multiplayer, but you could always talk to your playgroup. All told, as is, this setup will run you about $60 in paper, which puts it outside of budget build territory. Without the Galtas and Polyraptors, though, you can drop down closer to $30 or $40, and if you replace those with more vehicles or add in some more marauding raptors, you likely won't even see the difference in 7 out of 10 games, as this deck just eats life totals for breakfast. So that's the rundown on this uniquely 90s deck. Let me know what you think of it, or if you have any other suggestions to make it as broadly viable as possible, and what other kinds of decks you'd like to see covered. Street Sharks, anyone? I won't patronize you with a call to action, but if you'd like to patronize me on Patreon, you can't. I haven't made one, but you can at me on Twitter. Have a good one.